Meanwhile, Ingeborg remained confined, first in convents, later in isolated castles. For years, she lived in virtual imprisonment, writing letters to the Pope and begging for justice. Her surviving correspondence is haunting in its simplicity. She pleaded for mercy, for freedom, for recognition as the rightful queen. One letter to Pope Innocent reads, "I am your daughter, abandoned and shut away, though I am the lawful wife of the King of France. Have pity on me." It took over 7 years for the situation to shift. In 1200, the tide finally turned. Agnes of Morania had died in childbirth, a tragedy that shook even Philip's stony heart. And, conveniently, it made his bigamy problem disappear. The Pope lifted the interdict, France rejoiced, and Philip reluctantly agreed to reinstate Ingeborg, sort of. He brought her back to court, yes, but refused to actually live with her. They occupied separate residences, appeared together only for ceremonial occasions, and spoke as little as possible. It was a marriage in name, but not in spirit. The strangest part is that Ingeborg never gave up. She remained loyal to her title, addressing herself as Queen of France in every document. She continued petitioning the Church for full recognition, even decades after Agnes's death. At times, she seemed to exist as a quiet moral shadow at the edge of Philip's otherwise triumphant reign. And he was triumphant, defeating King John of England, expanding French territories, and reforming royal administration. He became one of France's greatest medieval kings. But in the background, there was always Ingeborg, his living reminder of a royal scandal he couldn't quite erase. Now, one might wonder what exactly went wrong that wedding night in 1193. Theories abound. Some suggest physical revulsion, perhaps a bad first impression. Others think political manipulation. Maybe Philip regretted the alliance once it offered fewer strategic gains. And some propose that he simply panicked, a bureaucratic mind confronted with the chaotic reality of another human being. Whatever the cause, it became one of the most infamous marriage disasters in medieval Europe. And yet, in the most ironic twist of all, Ingeborg outlived him by 14 years. Philip died in 1223, a respected monarch. Ingeborg, quietly residing in a convent at Corbeil, finally found peace, a queen without a throne, but at last without a king. So as we drift toward the close of this first tale, imagine that cold cathedral in Amiens where their wedding took place. August sunlight filtering through unfinished stained glass, courtiers whispering, bishops chanting, and somewhere amid the echoing vows, a young bride smiles shyly at a husband who already wishes to be anywhere else. History remembers kings for their conquests, but sometimes their greatest battles are fought in silence over love, pride, and the small human failures that no crown can disguise. Let's rest here for a moment, in the soft candlelight of the 12th century, and when you're ready, we'll drift onward to another royal debacle just as strange and just as doomed. Asterisk. But Edward never quite recovered. He remained erratic, distracted, and deeply unlucky. Worse, his marriage to Isabella, already rocky, began to collapse entirely. Isabella, after all, was a queen in name only. Edward's attention was elsewhere, and she had little influence at court. She tolerated it for years, perhaps hoping time or diplomacy might help. But instead of reforming, Edward found new companions. Enter Hugh Despenser the Younger, a nobleman who by all accounts made Gaveston look subtle. Despenser was everything Edward's enemies feared: ambitious, calculating, and entirely aware of how much the king adored him. He became Edward's constant companion, advisor, and, to use a modern term, enabler. Soon, Despenser's relatives filled court offices, seized lands, and extorted rivals. The nobility erupted in fury. They'd tolerated Gaveston's charm. They couldn't tolerate Despenser's greed. Rebellion followed again. At one point, the barons captured both Despensers and exiled them. Edward reacted in the only way he knew how, by sulking, then retaliating. Within a year, he had restored the Despensers to favor and taken revenge on every noble who'd opposed them. It was, to put it gently, not a recipe for stability. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella had had enough. Publicly humiliated, politically sidelined, and surrounded by her husband's cronies, she began to build her own power base. In 1325, when sent to France to negotiate peace, she simply didn't come back. While abroad, she met Roger Mortimer, a rebel noble who'd escaped from Edward's prisons. The two formed an alliance, professional, romantic, or possibly both, and together they plotted to remove Edward from power. When Isabella returned to England in 1326, she brought an army. Within weeks, the Despensers were captured. Both were executed gruesomely, as was the custom. Edward himself was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. What happened next is one of the great dark legends of English history. Edward, too, died in captivity in 1327 under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was natural causes. Unofficially, there were rumors, ghastly, sensational rumors, about how Isabella and Mortimer had arranged his death. But those stories, involving creative medieval torture, were later inventions, lurid fantasies more than fact. In reality, it's likely he was quietly murdered or simply neglected until he died. A sad, lonely end for a king who had once ruled one of Europe's strongest realms. And yet, even in failure, Edward II left a strange kind of legacy. He's remembered not as a tyrant or a conqueror, but as a man hopelessly out of step with his time. A king who loved unwisely, trusted unwisely, and governed not at all. In an age when masculinity was defined by war and dominance, Edward preferred friendship, affection, and pageantry to his contemporaries that made him weak. To us, it makes him oddly human. Let's drift for a moment into the quiet aftermath. After Edward's death, Isabella and Mortimer ruled in the name of young Edward III. It didn't last long. Within a few years, Edward III overthrew them. Mortimer was executed. Isabella quietly retired to a comfortable estate, and in her private chapel, she kept two things until her death: a small prayer book, and, according to chroniclers, a silver casket said to hold a lock of her late husband's hair, which may or may not be true, but feels perfectly medieval, a mix of guilt, sentiment, and symbolism. Edward II's story remains one of history's quiet tragedies, not for its violence, but for its loneliness. A king who loved too deeply, trusted too much, and ruled too poorly, who might have been happier as a craftsman, a scholar, or simply an ordinary man. But kings don't get to be ordinary, and Edward's world had no place for a monarch whose heart led him astray. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine him there, the misunderstood king, wandering through the echoing halls of a castle that was never quite his own, still searching, perhaps, for someone who understood him. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to medieval France, a place of cathedrals, half built, saints half believed, and kings who were very sure they were God's chosen representatives, when they weren't busy proving otherwise. If you've settled in, lights dimmed and blankets gathered, we'll start with a story of royal marriage gone wrong. It begins with a ceremony meant to unite kingdoms and ends, more or less, with two people avoiding eye contact for 20 years. This is the story of King Philip II of France and his unfortunate Danish bride, Queen Inge. A union so ill-fated that chroniclers ran out of polite ways to describe it. Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus, was not a romantic man. He was a capable king, methodical, calculating, fond of paperwork, and deeply committed to the idea that every square inch of France should belong to him. He wasn't handsome, or charming, or even particularly sociable. He was efficient, like a human tax ledger that had somehow learned to walk. By 1193, Philip was about 28, recently widowed, and more importantly, in need of a new queen. His first wife, Isabella of Hainaut, had died young after giving him a son. The French court, always mindful of dynastic stability, began the time-honored royal tradition of shopping for a suitable replacement. Now, France at the time was trying to play a delicate game of politics. To the south, there were the Plantagenet kings of England, who inconveniently owned more French land than the French king himself. To the north, the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway were growing powerful. So Philip's advisors thought, why not strengthen France's position with a Scandinavian alliance? Enter Princess Ingeborg of Denmark. She was young, well-born, and as far as anyone could tell, blessed with all the proper virtues for medieval queenship: noble blood, a respectable dowry, and a complete lack of political baggage. Her father, King Valdemar I, had been a well-regarded ruler. Her brother, King Canute VI, now sat on the Danish throne. A perfect match, in theory. The negotiations went smoothly. The dowry was agreed. The ships were prepared, and in August of 1193, Ingeborg arrived in France for her wedding. Everything was ready for a bright, royal future. Unfortunately, within a few hours of the ceremony, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Accounts vary, but the consistent theme is this: Philip took one look at his new wife and decided he wanted nothing to do with her. By the next morning, he was trying to send her home. Contemporary chroniclers, ever discreet, didn't quite know what to make of it. Some blamed a sudden illness. Others hinted at witchcraft. One claimed that the king had been bewitched at the wedding and that his revulsion was supernatural in origin, which, in medieval terms, was code for, we have no idea what's happening, but it's deeply embarrassing. Ingeborg, for her part, was bewildered. She barely spoke French. She had just arrived in a foreign land, and her new husband was already demanding an annulment. Within days, Philip had sent her off to a convent, essentially imprisoning her under the polite pretense of temporary seclusion. He then summoned church officials and insisted the marriage was invalid. His reasoning? Apparently, the union was against nature, a phrase vague enough to mean anything from distant cousins to "I changed my mind." When the bishops asked for details, Philip suggested they might be related within forbidden degrees of kinship. It was the medieval equivalent of saying, "I think she might be my cousin, somewhere back there." Possibly. Unfortunately for him, the church wasn't impressed. Papal representatives investigated and found no legitimate reason to dissolve the marriage. But Philip was not the kind of man who took no for an answer. He doubled down, declaring Ingeborg no longer queen, and sending polite letters to Rome, requesting that the Pope see reason. Pope Celestine III, however, was unmoved. The marriage, he said, was valid, and if the King of France didn't like it, he could kindly go back to his wife and stop making theological excuses. Philip ignored him instead. In 1196, he married again, quite illegally, to Agnes of Morania, a beautiful noblewoman from what's now Slovenia. Agnes was everything Ingeborg was not: warm, charming, and most importantly, willing. Philip paraded her at court, introduced her as queen, and insisted that the church simply had to accept reality. The church did not. Pope Innocent III, who had a flair for dramatic punishment, promptly placed France under interdict, meaning all church services, weddings and burials were suspended. The entire kingdom was, in essence, spiritually locked out. It was a bold move and deeply unpopular. The French people were furious. The clergy grumbled. Even Philip's allies began suggesting that maybe, just maybe, he should swallow his pride and take his actual wife back. But Philip held firm. He loved Agnes, he said, and besides, Ingeborg was unpleasant, which was, historically speaking, not the most convincing legal argument ever presented to the papacy. Another nun, from Yorkshire, escaped with a male accomplice. When caught, they claimed to be on pilgrimage. Technically true, just not in the direction approved by the abbess. Let's drift over to Italy, where convent life could be even more operatic. During the Renaissance, many convents became homes for the daughters of noble families, essentially elegant prisons, where women waited for their brothers to negotiate better marriages. Some of these women had money, education, and far too much time. So, they did what anyone would do in the 15th century. They started hosting musical performances. Florence and Venice saw the rise of the convent concert, nuns performing sacred music for invited audiences behind decorative screens. It was meant to be edifying. It was also, predictably, a social event. Wealthy patrons attended, sometimes for the art, sometimes for the novelty of hearing women's voices float from behind a lattice. And soon, rumors spread about flirtations conducted through music, admirers sending love notes disguised as hymn requests. One convent, Santa Radiganda in Milan, became so famous for its musical nuns that its abbess was accused of encouraging vanity, which, in fairness, she probably was. But the most infamous convent scandal of all belongs to Louise of Savoy and the Abbey of Saint Croix de Poitiers. In the 15th century, a group of nuns there was accused of, and these are the exact words from the report, worldly behavior that included dancing, drinking wine in the cloister, and wearing fashionable gowns instead of habits. When a new abbess tried to enforce discipline, the nuns revolted. They locked her out of the convent, barricaded the doors, and refused to open them for weeks. Eventually, soldiers were sent to restore order. When they broke down the doors, they found the rebellious nuns still inside, perfectly calm, eating cheese, and insisting they were acting in the name of spiritual liberty. One can't help but admire their commitment. Even the supposedly serene German convents had their moments. At Quedlinburg Abbey, the abbess was often a princess, a reminder that the convent was less about poverty and more about politics. The abbess had her own court, her own seal, and, occasionally, her own scandals involving excessive feasting. Visitors complained that the nuns dined too well-meaning. They ate meat, drank wine, and perhaps laughed a bit too loudly. For a community sworn to austerity, that was basically an international incident. Still, Quedlinburg endured for centuries, ruled by women who managed to combine prayer, politics, and pastry with admirable efficiency. By now, you've probably noticed a theme. Convents were supposed to be places of withdrawal, little islands of holiness in a noisy, sinful world. But human nature doesn't really stop at the cloister gate. Inside those walls, there were still rivalries, friendships, ambitions, and a steady undercurrent of mischief. And every so often, something would go delightfully wrong. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet corridors of a medieval convent, the sound of distant chanting, the faint echo of sandals on stone, and somewhere, behind a carved wooden door, a group of nuns whispering about the abbess's new hairstyle, or plotting to sneak an extra bottle of wine into the refectory. Because holiness, it turns out, was never quite as simple as it looked in the frescoes. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to early 14th century England, a kingdom of cold stone halls, endless feasts, and very delicate egos. A time when kings were supposed to be warriors, queens were supposed to be decorative, and everyone was pretending not to notice that none of it was going to plan. Our focus tonight is King Edward II, one of history's most fascinating royal oddities, a man born to be a warrior king, who mostly wanted to hang out with his friends, build swimming pools, and give lavish gifts to the men he liked best. Edward ruled England from 1307 to 1327, and his 20-year reign was a slow-motion train wreck of favoritism, rebellion, and poor decision-making. He was also, depending on who you ask, either a misunderstood, romantic, or a medieval cautionary tale about mixing politics with passion. So tonight, we'll drift through his life, quietly, gently, and with the mild disbelief of someone watching a royal family self-destruct in very slow motion. Edward was born in 1284, the fourth son of Edward I, the mighty hammer of the Scots. A father who was, by all accounts, large, intimidating, and very proud of both qualities. Edward I spent most of his reign conquering Wales, bullying Scotland, and generally making life unpleasant for everyone north of London. He was, in short, exactly the kind of father who would look at his dreamy, artsy youngest son and think, this one's going to be a problem. And he wasn't wrong. Young Edward wasn't interested in war or statecraft. He liked pageantry, music, and rather famously, manual labor. He'd hang out with the castles, masons, blacksmiths, and boat builders, helping them work while chatting about theology and dinner, which, in fairness, made him rather charming, but also wildly confusing to his father, who considered conversation with commoners only slightly less acceptable than tax evasion. And then came Piers. Gaveston Piers was a Gascon knight, handsome, clever, and ambitious in that way that usually meant trouble. He met Edward around 1300, when both were in their late teens, and from that point on, the two were nearly inseparable. Edward adored him. He called Piers his brother, his sweetest companion, and, in letters, my beloved, contemporary. Chroniclers noticed, because medieval people noticed everything, and began quietly murmuring that perhaps their bond was not purely spiritual. Now, historians still debate what their relationship truly was. But even in the most conservative reading, Edward's affection for Piers went well beyond friendship. He showered him with titles, gifts, and power. And as it turns out, England wasn't ready for a royal bromance. When Edward's father, Edward I, discovered the friendship, he was not amused. The elder king had a talent for rage, and apparently declared that he'd rather banish Piers Gaveston to the ends of the earth than let him distract his son, which he did. Piers was exiled to France. Young Edward, heartbroken, moped around the royal household, writing letters begging for his return. He even refused to eat at one point, in what can only be described as medieval royal sulking. When Edward I died in 1307, his son, now Edward II, King of England at 23, had the power to do exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted, almost immediately, was to bring Piers back. Now, here's where things got awkward. Edward's coronation in 1308 should have been a moment of triumph. New king, new queen. He had just married Isabella of France, the teenage daughter of King Philip IV, one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. A political alliance meant to secure peace between England and France. But instead of devoting attention to his dazzling new wife, Edward spent the entire event glued to Gaveston's side. He even made Piers the master of ceremonies, a role that gave him control over everything from seating arrangements to crown placement. The French delegation, naturally, was scandalized. They'd come expecting a royal wedding. What they got looked suspiciously like a third wheel situation. One chronicler later wrote that Isabella's relatives left greatly angered, especially when Edward gave Gaveston the royal jewels, gifts meant for his bride. It was not an ideal start to the marriage, and so England's barons began to mutter. They already disliked Gaveston, who, as a foreigner and a favourite, had risen far above his station. But now he was flaunting his influence, dressing extravagantly, and mocking the nobility with cruel nicknames. He called one earl the Black Dog of Arden, and another the Burst Belly. Not the kind of banter that wins friends. Eventually, the barons banded together and demanded that the king exile Gaveston again. Edward reluctantly agreed, but sent him off with an impressive array of gifts, lands, and titles to tide him over. Gaveston, meanwhile, treated exile as a brief vacation. He lived comfortably in Ireland as the king's appointed lieutenant, throwing feasts and issuing proclamations in Edward's name. In a way, he was still ruling, just with better weather, but Edward couldn't let him go. Within a year, Gaveston was back again, welcomed into England with music, processions, and, one imagines, the collective groaning of the nobility. It didn't last. By 1312, tensions had boiled over. The barons rose in rebellion, captured Gaveston, and after a few tense weeks, executed him. Edward was devastated. Chroniclers say he wept publicly, refused food again, and ordered an elaborate funeral. He had Gaveston's body reinterred in a grand tomb years later, visiting it often. By medieval standards, that was excessive affection for a disgraced courtier. And yet, life went on. Kings, even grieving ones, had to keep ruling. Eventually, someone decided that maybe drainage ditches could help, and then maybe stone curbs to separate the human from the organic. A slow evolution toward hygiene, powered by the desire not to be hit by surprise buckets of misery. Let's not forget bed safety, a deeply underrated category. Beds in castles were high, often 4 or 5 feet off the ground, with wooden frames and rope supports. They were comfortable but unstable, and people routinely fell out of them, especially if they were drunk, ill, or wearing elaborate sleeping garments that could strangle them. So, the bed rail made its first appearance, a simple bar of wood along the edge, keeping drowsy nobles from tumbling into a medieval concussion. You might thank them tonight, as you tuck yourself safely between your mattress and wall. And finally, There was the most important medieval safety innovation of all, common sense, which, tragically, was always late to the party. Every improvement from moats that didn't poison the well, to bridges that didn't kill spectators, to staircases that didn't murder dukes, came only after someone important had met a creatively inconvenient end. The peasants had, of course, been dying in these ways for centuries, but it took a nobleman falling into his own toilet for anyone to call it a design flaw. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, every guardrail, every safety lock, every warning label exists because someone, once upon a time, didn't have one, and somewhere, in a musty castle ruin, their ghost is still quietly muttering, maybe we should have added a railing. Asterisk, hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, darker corner of the Middle Ages, a place where piety met politics, and where a surprising number of people accidentally invented chaos while trying very hard to be holy. So dim the lights. Maybe make yourself a cup of something warm, ideally not mead, unless you want to fall asleep halfway through, which, actually, that's fine, because tonight's story is about medieval convents, those solemn, sacred spaces where women went to find peace, purpose, and occasionally, scandal. Now, you might imagine a medieval convent as a haven of calm stone walls, flickering candles, silent corridors echoing with chants. And sometimes it was exactly that. But sometimes it was also a power struggle, a social club, or an extended passive-aggressive sleepover between noble women who didn't get along. So tonight, we're drifting gently through the world of nuns, novices, and abbesses, a world where vows of chastity met dynastic ambition, where silence was relative, and where even the holiest communities somehow managed to end up in trouble. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, joining a convent wasn't always a spiritual decision. Sometimes it was a convenient one. If you were a noblewoman without a marriage alliance, your options were limited. Wed someone dreadful, or become someone holy. Parents, ever practical, often chose the latter. After all, an unmarried daughter in a convent was one less dowry to pay. The problem, of course, was that not everyone sent to a convent wanted to be there. And that's where many scandals began, with reluctant nuns who hadn't exactly chosen the nun life, but had the nun life thrust upon them. Take, for example, the case of Isabella of France, the daughter of King Philip IV. She was packed off to the convent of Poissy as a child, largely for educational purposes, a sort of royal daycare run by women in women. The nuns adored her, of course. She was royal, clever, and already showing a flair for drama. But Isabella wasn't there to stay. She was later married off to the future Edward II of England, and perhaps she learned something from those early convent years, perhaps about the politics of enclosed women, or perhaps about patience, because as an adult, she became one of the most ruthless queens in English history, ultimately helping overthrow her own husband. We can't prove that she picked up her sense of intrigue at Poissy, but it's not impossible. After all, medieval convents were as political as any royal court, just with more incense. Now, let's drift to one of the more notorious convents, the Abbey of Fontevraud. In France, founded in the early 12th century by Robert of Arbrissel, a man whose idea of holiness included founding a double monastery housing both monks and nuns. He believed in female spiritual superiority, which was a radical idea at the time. So, naturally, people were suspicious from the start. Fontevraud was led entirely by abbesses, who ruled over both women and men. A fine idea in theory. In practice, it led to centuries of rumors about impropriety, favoritism, and the occasional monk who mysteriously seemed to spend an awful lot of time in the women's cloister. Of course, official records insisted everything was proper and chaste. But medieval chroniclers, being medieval chroniclers, couldn't resist hinting otherwise. So, Fontevraud's reputation alternated between a beacon of piety and the most elegant scandal in Christendom. But if you really wanted scandal, you had to look north to England, and specifically to the Abbey of Godstow. Godstow was founded in the 12th century, and later became famous for something that technically happened after everyone was dead. It was the burial site of Rosamond Clifford, known as Fair Rosamond, the famously beautiful mistress of King Henry II. Now, Henry had been married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, as history kindly reminds us, was not the sort of woman who took betrayal lightly. When Rosamond died under mysterious, probably unpoisoned circumstances, Henry had her buried at Godstow Abbey. He even visited her tomb regularly, praying there with suspicious devotion. The nuns, recognizing an opportunity, treated the king with all the warmth one usually reserves for an incoming tax exemption. Unfortunately, when Henry died, Queen Eleanor made sure that Rosamond's shrine was dismantled. The nuns were scolded by the church for allowing a harlot's tomb to become a place of pilgrimage. It's unclear whether they were genuinely sorry, or just sorry to see the royal donations dry up. Either way, Godstow's reputation never quite recovered. It became known as that abbey, the one that hosted the king's mistress. A medieval version of that friend's house where something questionable happened. Let's pause here and remember, not all convent scandals were salacious. Some were just bureaucratically absurd. Take the Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain. It was founded by royalty and staffed almost entirely by women of noble birth. Over time, the Abbess of Las Huelgas became one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. She could appoint clergy, hold court, and even command knights, which was all very impressive until someone in Rome realized that an abbess technically wasn't supposed to be a feudal overlord. There were meetings. There were letters. The abbess politely ignored them all. For centuries, the church tried to curtail her authority, and for centuries, she smiled, nodded, and continued doing whatever she pleased. Eventually, the papacy gave up. Sometimes, even Rome knew when to pick its battles. Of course, not all convents were havens for noble defiance. Some were simply chaotic in that uniquely medieval way. The convent of Wilton, in England, was once so mismanaged that visiting bishops described it as dissolute, which was the 14th century equivalent of calling something a bit of a mess. The nuns were accused of neglecting prayers, skipping fasts, and, in one particularly British complaint, allowing small dogs to disturb the divine office. Apparently. The abbess had a fondness for tiny yapping laps who followed her everywhere, including to chapel. So, during evening prayers, the choir was occasionally accompanied by a chorus of barking. It's unclear whether this was considered spiritually uplifting. Eventually, the bishop intervened, issuing strict reforms. No pets in the choir stalls. One imagines the abbess was heartbroken. Then there were the runaway nuns, a surprisingly common medieval phenomenon. Despite vows of enclosure, some women simply decided that the convent life wasn't working out. Reasons varied: boredom, romance, or just a deep and sudden desire to see something other than a stone wall. In England, records show multiple cases of nuns absconding from their convents and being hunted down by local sheriffs like very polite fugitives. One runaway nun was found living under an assumed name in a nearby village. When questioned, she said she'd simply grown tired of the rule, an answer so disarmingly honest that the bishop didn't quite know what to do with her. Asterisk. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the word safety was more of a rumor than a principle. Go ahead and get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket like a slightly confused monk preparing for evening prayers. Because tonight's topic is medieval safety features, the things people invented only after realizing, usually the hard way, that boiling oil, collapsing towers, and exploding toilets were not great for the population numbers now. The Middle Ages had many admirable qualities. Architecture that still stands, cathedrals that touched the sky, but when it came to preventing preventable deaths, let's just say, they were enthusiastic improvisers, and they only invented most safety measures, because someone, often a noble someone, perished in a particularly ridiculous manner. So, let's begin our gentle, meandering tour through history's slow, painful discovery of maybe we shouldn't do that again. Let's start with castles, because they were basically medieval death traps, disguised as status symbols. You might imagine a castle as a fortress of safety, stone walls, tall towers, deep moats. But in reality, the average medieval castle was a combination of drafty corridors, slippery stairs, and what can only be described as structural optimism. Staircases were particularly deadly. They were narrow, spiraling, and uneven, not because of some design flaw, but on purpose. They twisted clockwise upward so that right-handed defenders could swing swords downward more easily, which meant that any visitor, particularly if they were a left-handed noble or had consumed half a gallon of ale, which was most people, risked tumbling down the stairs like an armored potato. Eventually, after enough concussions, the more thoughtful architects began adding handrails, not for convenience, not for accessibility, but because one duke fell down an entire spiral staircase, survived, and decided that future dukes should at least have the option of clinging to something on the way down. Handrails, invented because of gravity and pride. Then there was the moat. A moat, theoretically, kept enemies out. In practice, it mostly kept sanitation out. They were filled not with clear water, but with whatever happened to flow nearby, runoff, animal waste, and occasionally, the bodies of soldiers who had forgotten how swimming armor worked. This led to outbreaks of things that we now call waterborne diseases, but which medieval people called God's mysterious punishments. The first safety improvement came when a few smarter lords started lining their moats with clay to prevent seepage into wells and drinking water. It was primitive environmental engineering, an early attempt at what we'd call containment, because it turns out having your castle surrounded by a liquid cesspit wasn't as majestic as it sounded. Let's drift over to the kitchen, which was the most flammable place in medieval Europe. Open fires, wooden ceilings, hanging herbs, and cooks in long, flowing wool robes. It's amazing anyone survived long enough to invent bread pudding in early medieval castles. The kitchen was inside the main building. And then, one day, one caught fire. And so did the castle. And that was that. After enough blazes reduced noble residences to expensive campfires, Architects finally decided, perhaps we should move the kitchen outside, and thus the detached kitchen was born, a revolutionary safety feature that existed solely because people got tired of watching dinner turn into arson. Now, let's talk about toilets, or, as the medieval world called them, garderobes. They were essentially holes in the wall, vertical shafts leading to open air, or, if you were lucky, directly into the moat. Privacy was minimal, hygiene non-existent, but here's the fun part. Garderobes were built into castle walls, and those walls were thick. So, the interior shaft became a sort of cozy nook, perfect for an assassin to crawl into. And yes, it happened. There are recorded incidents of attackers climbing up through the toilet, shoot to ambush sleeping nobles. After the third or fourth death by latrine infiltration, engineers started designing garderobes with bends, grates, or steep drops to discourage such unsanitary heroics. It was, arguably, the first medieval security upgrade, because nothing ruins one's royal dignity, quite like being assassinated from below while using the facilities. Moving on to bridges. Another proud source of avoidable tragedy. Medieval bridges were marvels of engineering and hubris. They were often built without guardrails. After all, if you fell into the river, you should have been paying attention. The idea of building sides on a bridge to stop carriages from rolling off was apparently too modern. But, as history goes, someone always provided a demonstration. In 1185, for example, a wooden bridge in York collapsed under the weight of onlookers watching a procession. Dozens drowned. It was only after that event that English builders began reinforcing bridge sides, not out of compassion, but because the cost of retrieving floating clergy had become rather inconvenient. Now, if we drift into the royal wardrobe, we'll find yet another unintentional hazard. The clothing of the elite was designed less for movement and more for demonstrating that movement was unnecessary. Trains stretched for meters, sleeves dangled like decorative curtains, and crowns, heavy, painfully so, the combination of gold, jewels, and questionable neck strength often led to what chroniclers gently called royal posture difficulties. Basically, lifelong back pain from too much dignity. After several monarchs suffered from what we might now diagnose as compressed vertebrae, artisans began lightening crowns, switching to hollow designs. So, the next time you see a dainty little coronet in a museum, remember, it's not fashion, it's pain management. Let's float now into the banquet hall, where medieval safety standards were a matter of creative trust. Food poisoning was so common that people developed entire theological explanations for it. If you survived a feast, you were blessed. If you didn't, well, perhaps God didn't like how you ate your soup. The most tragic part was that silver cutlery existed, but most people preferred to eat with knives, fingers, or whatever was nearby. It wasn't until repeated episodes of the entire wedding party fell ill after stew that nobles started hiring professional tasters, which sounds like luxury, but was basically outsourcing your risk of death. So yes, food safety was invented by kings who didn't want to die of stew. Then there was armor, humanity's early attempt at wearable security. Unfortunately, it often made things worse. The heavier the armor, the more impressive the knight, and the more likely he was to drown, suffocate, or fall off a horse like an extremely expensive turtle. One chronicler describes a knight who fell face first in mud during a tournament and couldn't get up until his squires pried him out. After enough such incidents, Armorers began adding breathing holes in helmets and quick-release fastenings. Practical innovation through mild humiliation. And then there were battlements, those classic crenellated castle tops that look so orderly in pictures. What most people forget is that medieval builders initially made those parapets far too low. Good for firing arrows, bad for not falling over. So yes, early castle walls came with what could best be described as optional survival. Soldiers could trip, lose footing on mossy stone, or simply be startled by an incoming arrow and gone. Eventually, the upright blocks were made taller and ledges added. Some castles even included drainage grooves because too many guards had slipped on rainwater. The Middle Ages, one long safety memo written in blood, mud, and poor balance. Let's drift to churches, because piety didn't protect anyone from bad architecture. Gothic cathedrals were awe-inspiring, yes, but also structurally ambitious in ways that occasionally contradicted gravity. Flying buttresses were the miracle of their age, designed to hold up walls so thin they might as well have been paper. But before buttresses, many churches simply collapsed. It took several unfortunate cave-ins during Mass before engineers decided maybe they should rethink the more windows, fewer walls philosophy. Thus, the buttress, an architectural safety feature born from divine enthusiasm and tragic physics. Then there were candles. Medieval homes were dark, and people used open flames for light, which was fine, until you remembered that most furniture, curtains, and hair were highly flammable. Fires were constant, especially in crowded cities like London or Paris. After enough catastrophic blazes, people started using metal holders and lanterns instead of open wax sticks, not because of some sweeping regulation, but because one too many nobles woke up to find their drapes enthusiastically burning. And, of course, the streets. Medieval cities had no sidewalks, no lighting, and, usually, no sanitation plan. People threw chamber pots from upper windows, yelling a polite gardes, low, or watch out for the water, which was optimistic phrasing for what was actually falling. Asterisk,